how do you feel about cross-stitching on this? Or maybe these? Yes, we're talking about cross-stitching on dark fabric, so dark blue, dark green, and of course black fabric. Let's be honest, it can be a little bit trickier. But it can also be totally worth it, because for some designs it just really makes the colours pop. And of course, I'm here with some tips to help you out. Hi everyone, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily. I'm here to help you up-level your cross-stitch game with tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your stitching. If you're new around here, then make sure to subscribe. And as always, I'll put any links that I mention in this video in the description below. Okay, before we dive into the tips, and I have 9 of them for you, let me show you why you might want to stitch on dark fabric. So here's a design I've stitched on white Aida. I've stitched a couple of these small presents on white fabric, and you could be using this for a really cute greeting card. And here's the same design stitched on black, and I think it looks amazing. Of course, not every design is going to look good on dark fabric. You do want colours like these ones here that are going to stand out against the dark background. But it can look so good that it is really worth trying. So let's dive into some tips that can make it a bit easier. Okay, so tip number 1 is good lighting from the top of your design. So either save these projects to stitch in daylight or use an overhead daylight LED lamp, and this is what I do. And I can show you that because if I turn off my lights that I've got on at the moment, you can see how much harder that's going to be to stitch. So let's pop those back on. Now this links in with tip number 2, which is that it's really helpful to have something white underneath your fabric because it makes it easier to see the holes. So some people like to stitch with a pillowcase on their lap, or some people use a light box. I just hold my fabric over my pattern. If I turn that over, you can see how much easier it is to see the holes with that white underneath. Or if I'm stitching while watching TV, you can hold your stitching up to the TV and the light behind will shine through. Tip number 3 is to use a hoop, because the extra tension in the fabric can make it easier to see the holes. Now I know I don't usually use a hoop, and no, I don't even with dark fabric, but it can be really helpful. Tip number 4 is to choose your fabric carefully. So I've stitched this on Aida, and that's definitely going to be easier to stitch on than using linen. But you can also use a lower count fabric, because the holes are often slightly bigger, so that could be a lot easier to stitch on. The downside to this is that thread coverage on black fabric can be a little bit, well, it's not quite as good. So if you use lower count fabrics, then that's going to be even more of a problem. I've stitched this one on 16 count and the thread coverage is pretty good. Tip number 5 is to use your needle to feel the holes. And this is definitely something I do. In fact, I do this all the time when I'm stitching, but it's especially good for dark fabric. And I'll try and show you what I mean, which is that I use my needle, I sort of run it along the fabric until I can feel it just dipping into that hole. And the same on the back. I'm going to run it along the back until I can feel it. You can feel when it pops into that hole and you know you're in the right place. Now, if you want to make this even easier, what you can do is try a ball tip needle. They have a little tiny ball on the end of the needle, and that helps you find the holes more easily. But even without, just feeling your way can really be helpful. Tip number 6 is to mix up your projects, to rest your eyes. So I would only stitch on dark fabric like this for a fairly short session because it can be really hard on the eyes. It's a good excuse to have lots of projects on the go, I think. Tip number 7 is to use a magnifier. So some lamps come with these on, or you can get reading glasses that magnify, or headlamps with magnifying lenses. Now, I don't have any of those to show you here, I'm afraid. Tip number 8 is to keep it simple, especially if it's your first time stitching on dark fabric. So something like this, small, simple, easy patterns with no fractional stitches, that's definitely the easiest way to go if you're stitching on dark fabric. And tip number 9 is take it slow. Just make peace with the fact that it's going to take a little bit longer to stitch on dark fabric. and just enjoy the process. Okay, that's my top tips for cross-stitching on dark fabric. Now I'll leave you with one final thought, which is don't feel like you have to stitch on dark fabric if it's not something that you enjoy and it takes all the fun out of it for you. Because cross-stitch is supposed to be fun, so just use whatever you prefer. But if you do want to try out dark fabric, or you've tried it in the past and it was a bit of a hassle, then I hope this video has given you some tips to help you out. Make sure to subscribe because there's lots more good stitchy stuff on the way. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!